Alright, hi guys, welcome to Coding 2. Missing you guys doing the in-person stuff, but I hope you are getting on well with this stuff from home. So just a little bit of a recap of what we've already done. We've mainly been looking at game design. I know I said we'd be going into web design this week, but I thought that would be better to do when we're back together again. So we're sticking with games because that's what we're used to. So we did the platformer already. If you followed Tuesday's YouTube tutorial, you will have learned about how to make a top-down scroller game like this. This was the tutorial I sent to you guys, top-down scroller part 1, scrolling. This was what I came up with by following that tutorial. As you can see, I can kind of guide my little square around, the little maze that I made, and as the player moves, the map scrolls with it, and it's top down because it's kind of viewed from the top. Now this would be great for making a game like Among Us, or all you'd need to do is just replace the square for an Among Us character and use a map from Among Us and use this green or maybe another color as the walls, and you can just control what happens when one character comes close to another character using the sensing tools. So lots of opportunities there. Just to change it up again this week, we're going to go back into app design. I know we've already done our food suggestion app if you were here last week. This week we're going to move over to making like a streaming service app. That in the app you're able to tell the application what streaming services you have that you're subscribed to, and then rather than having to go between each different streaming service to see what each streaming service has, this app can tell you give you a list of what's on every single streaming service all in one app. So that's kind of the purpose of it, solving a real world problem. We're going to be actually doing this in Python. Our food recipe app we made in Scratch, if you remember, but we're going to be working in Python today. So you will need to go to repl.it. That's repl.it, and then sign in to your Google account. If you need to pause the video, you can. Here's just a sneak preview of what we're going to be making today. I'm just going to click run. And you can see in my console down here, it says, do you have Netflix? I'm going to say, yes, I do. I'm going to say, do you have Disney Plus? And I'm going to say, no, I don't have Disney Plus. And then it says, do you have Amazon Prime? And I say, yes, I do. And then it's kind of boring at the moment. It just says show 1, show 2, show 3. But interestingly, then goes to show 7, show 8, show 9. And so it's just showing me the shows that are on Netflix and Amazon Prime, but it's not showing me the shows on Disney Plus because I don't have Disney Plus. Whereas if I was to say I didn't have Netflix, I did have Disney Plus, and I didn't have Amazon Prime, it's now only showing me show 4, show 5, and show 6, which it didn't show before, and it's not showing me the shows that are on Netflix and Amazon Prime. And of course, if I say yes to all, it's going to show me all the shows that are on those streaming services. It's very simple. Ideally, we would add some extra functionality to that, but I'm going to leave that to you as a challenge. We're just going to show you how I made this simple word-based streaming service app, kind of compiling all the episodes together. So to start off, you're just going to create a new REPL. You're going to click in the menu in the top left and click New REPL. You're going to be working in the Python language today. And you can either go with the default name, or you could call it something like streaming. I'm just going to call it stream all, because that's kind of what we're trying to do, is to get all of the streaming services in one place. We call it stream all. I'm going to click create. It's going to give me a brand new blank canvas to code in. Okay, so first of all, we need to make some variables. And so just for good practice, I'm going to use some commenting. So I'm going to do hashtag, and then I'm going to type variable so that anyone that's going into my program at a later date can know that what I'm doing now is listing out all the variables that I need. And the variables that I'm going to use, I'm just going to use 3, and they're going to store whether the user does or does not have any particular streaming service. So the data type we're going to use is Boolean, because they either do or they don't. True or false, yes or no, on or off. That's Boolean. Okay? So to do that, I'm going to call my first variable user, and I'm going to use snake case, which is where you put an underscore between each word. User has, and this one is going to store whether the user has Netflix. And to start off with, I'm just going to set it to 0. Now I know I'm kind of defining it as a number here and not a Boolean, but because this is going to change anyway, it doesn't matter. I could put false, I could put 0, it doesn't matter, but I just like to initially just set all of my variables as 0. I'm then going to make 2 more for the other 2 streaming services. User has Disney, Disney Plus, so that's 0, and user has Amazon Prime. Of course, you can add other streaming services. If you have other streaming services, there's no limit. You can do whatever you want. Okay, so rather than writing all the code kind of just one line after the other, we're going to use functions. Now we've done functions in Scratch, and we kind of touched on using functions in Python, but we're just going to really practice how to use functions in Python. And what's really useful about functions is that you can basically, for code that is very repetitive that you might do a lot of times, or code that you just want to appear nice and simple in your code, you can almost define a function elsewhere, just like in Scratch where you're defining it somewhere else on the screen, but when you call it, it's just in one block. So you get like really nice clean code. And so when you're actually running the program, it just runs the function and then it refers to where you define the function. So we're going to define our functions first, and then we'll actually call them. So the first function that we're going to define is where the user is going to tell the program what streaming services they have. So again, I'm going to use commenting. I'm going to now list all of my functions. And the first function is going to be user selects what streaming services they have. Now, in order to define a function, we use the term def, short for define, and then we're going to name our function. Now, you're already familiar with functions in Python like print and input. Those are functions. You just might not have referred to them like that before. And now we're going to make our own function. It's kind of like making your own block in Scratch. And so we're going to call, just like with our variables, we're going to use a very descriptive name. So we're going to call this function choose your streaming services. And maybe I'll do snake case here too. Just putting underscores in between each thing. And in order to make it a function, I need to put open and close brackets. I also need a colon. Okay, so I'm just going to do define, choose your streaming services, open brackets, close brackets, and a colon. And now when I hit enter, it automatically indents everything underneath. So when I'm typing, there's a nice little space. So that is required. If I didn't have the space, then it wouldn't work correctly. So don't backspace when you start, otherwise you're already going to come into syntax problems. Now, what's interesting about functions, if we want to use our variables, we in a way need to call them again into a function. It's kind of like how when you make a variable in Scratch, when you click make a variable, let's see inside, we've got our variables on here on the left. When I click make a variable and name it, I have the option to make it visible to all sprites or just the sprite that I'm currently in. I'm currently in the player sprite, and when I click make a variable and name it, I can either say all the sprites can use it or only this sprite can use it. And in a similar way, I need to make sure that in my function that I can use the variables that I made. So up here I've kind of made variables that all functions or all sprites can use them. And in order to call them into my function, I need to type the word global. Global. So I'm just going to type the word global space and then type the name of the function that I want to use within, or sorry, the name of the variable that I want to use within this function. So I want the user has Netflix variable. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to type another global. So this is known as a global variable. So it can be used and changed throughout the code. The opposite of a global variable is a local variable. So that's kind of like if I just wanted the variable to be applied to just that sprite instead of all the sprites, and then only this function would have access to that variable. And if I were to use the variable outside, it wouldn't reference this variable inside. It would be a local variable. But we need our global variables. So I'm going to type user has Disney Plus, and finally global user has Amazon Prime. And you obviously need to make sure that your spelling is exactly the same in both cases, otherwise we'll be calling the wrong variable. So the first thing I want to do is to ask the user for input. So I'm going to use the input function to ask them if they have each of these streaming services, and I'm going to store that result within the variables that I have. So I'm going to store temporarily that if my user has Netflix, I'll store Y, the letter Y, in that variable. So to do that, I don't need to use my global word. I can just now refer to it because I've already kind of called it. I can just say user has Netflix. And I'm going to set that equal to, and then I'm going to use my input function to find out whether the user has Netflix. So I've typed input all in lowercase and it's gone purple, so I know that Python has recognized it. And then I'm now going to type my prompt. So I'm going to use speech marks. You need to use speech marks within this, just like with the print function. And I'm going to say, do you have Netflix? Question mark. And then I'm going to put a space, just so that it formats nicely on the screen. And then, maybe so that the user knows what to write, I'll type Y or N in brackets. And again, I'll put another space. Maybe I'll put a colon at the end just so they realize that they have to type something. And I'm going to do this for each of my variables. User has, I'm just going to copy and paste that down, make it a bit quicker for myself. Disney Plus, input, do you have Disney Plus, Y or N? And finally, user has Amazon Prime, input, do you have Amazon Prime, Y or N, colon, space. Okay, and I just want to check that I've used the same variable name, that is all spelled correctly. User has Netflix, that looks good. And it's the same at the top here. Just do that for each of them, just so I can make sure that I've spelled everything correctly, otherwise it won't work. Now just to test my code, I am going to, well, maybe we won't test it right now. Yeah, let's test it. So I will print whatever is stored in user has Netflix. And in fact, because this is a variable, I don't need the speech marks. We'll just test the user has Netflix one. In order to call this function, I now need to come out of the function. I need to shift tab to go back, or I could have used the backspace. So now I'm outside of the function. So now I'm actually writing the code that my program will follow, and I need to call the function. So to call the function, I'm just going to type the name of the function followed by the open and close brackets, and you'll notice that when I start typing, hopefully, no, maybe it's not doing it. Usually it would come up with a prompt because it recognizes that that function exists. I'm just going to copy and paste to save time. And so when I call this function in my code on line 21, it will run this code and it'll ask me what I have, and then it will print the whatever is stored in Netflix. So if I say I do have Netflix, it should just print the letter Y. So let's run the code. Do you have Netflix? Y. Do you have Disney Plus? I'll say no, and I'll say no. And in theory, if this works, it should print the value that is stored in user has Netflix. Let's hit enter, and good. It stored my Y and printed it again. But I need to convert this Y value into a true or false value so that Python understands it. So I actually need to use some if conditions, and I'm going to reassign the variables. So we're going to type the word if, and then we'll call our user has Netflix variable, and we'll say if user has Netflix equals Y. If they've said that they have Netflix, I need two equals to compare the two, to say if the value stored in here is the same as this value here. I need a colon. Make sure you have speech marks around the Y. Then it will do this. And what I want it to do is to convert the letter Y, the value Y, to the value true, because the computer will understand it better. So user has Netflix equals Y, then I'm going to reassign what is stored in the user has Netflix variable by setting it equal to true. And I need to use a capital T in order for Python to recognize it as the Boolean value true. And you can see it's gone blue. Now I could here say else if user has Netflix equals N and then code it to false, but what I'm going to do instead is just use a regular old else. The reason I'm doing that is because if they type in anything except for Y, then they have either typed N, probably, or they've just typed, they did a typo by mistake. And in either of those cases, I want the variable to be set to false. So I'm going to say user has Netflix set to false. Okay. So this should work now, where it will say if the value stored in user has Netflix equals Y. So if the user said, yes, I have Netflix, it stored it in there, and it says if it is Y, then set the value of Netflix, user has Netflix equal to true. Otherwise, set the value to false because they don't have it. And all I'm going to do now is kind of copy and paste this code underneath. Make sure I'm tabbed in the right place. If by accident I was to put it here, the code wouldn't work. But to change that, I can see that kind of it's in a different line, and these lines down here help me. I can select it all and hit tab, and it moves it all in. And just to make it a bit more clear, I'm going to put a space. I'm going to copy this again, because I'm now going to convert my 3 values to Boolean values. But now I'm not going to say Netflix, I'm going to say Disney Plus. I'm going to change Netflix to Disney Plus in all of these cases. So wherever it says Netflix, change to Disney Plus. And in this case, I'm going to change it to Amazon Prime. And if the user doesn't have Amazon Prime, set user has Amazon Prime to false. Okay, fantastic. So that is the end of my function. Just to review, I call in my variables, which I already defined up here. I temporarily stored the value y or n, depending on if the user has any of the streaming services in each of the variables, and then I converted the y or n to true or false, depending on what was stored. If it was y, I stored it to true. If it was anything else, n, typo, even little y would set the value to false. So maybe I should have said enter capital Y or capital N, but hopefully in this case this should work. So what I will do now to test my streaming services function is outside of the function I'm going to print what is stored in each of these variables. So I want to print what's stored in user has prime. Copy and paste that. I'll do them in the order that I ask. So first one was Netflix. And then the next one was Disney Plus. Okay. So this is where my function is being called. This is my actual code. My code is only 4 lines. This is where you see the advantage of a function. My code here is 4 lines, but it's calling this function, which is many lines, but it's stored all the way at the top. And so I can actually separate this out by, just like I did with my variables and my functions, I'm going to use comments to say this is my code. Nice and neat. Choose your streaming service is the first thing that it does, and then it's going to print out whatever's stored in these variables. Just test whether it works. So we're going to hit run. Oh, we have a problem. I have an issue with one of my else statements. It's on line 26. What did I do wrong? Aha. For some reason, this else thing was tabbed in incorrectly. That needs to be back here. And this has also been tabbed incorrectly. So you see here, it says unindent does not match any outer indentation. So if it's saying the word indent or unindent, it's because your indentations are wrong. Correct indentation kind of goes, starts here, and then it goes in, then it comes out, and then it goes in again. So let's see if that fixes the code. Great. So it says, do you have Netflix? Yes. So at this point, it's storing the value y in the variable. Do you have user has Netflix? I'm going to say I don't have Disney Plus. I'm going to say well, that's just for the sake of argument. If I were to type B instead of N, because I missed the N key, and just to demonstrate that it will still come out as false because I used the else function or the else statement. And now when I hit enter, it will check what I wrote in all of those and reassign them either a true or false value, and then hopefully it should print for Netflix true, for Disney Plus false, and for Amazon Prime false. Which when I hit enter, it should say true, false, false. Let's find out. Woohoo! True, false, false. So we have now stored whether we have those streaming services as a true or false value, which is a useful data type that we can use. So now we can use that to create our master list of episodes or videos or movies that are stored within those streaming services, and only return the videos that are stored in the streaming services that the user owns. So to do that, we're going to make another function, and we're going to use another descriptive name, and first of all just comment it just to tell people visiting my code or seeing my code what this function does. Let's say it returns all the shows the user has access to. Okay, just like with my previous function, I need to type def for define, and I'm going to call this one return all shows. This function is actually going to return a value to the user. It's almost going to store some data depending on what happens within the function. So just like I did in the previous function, I need to bring in my global variables. Now you could type them out again. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to highlight them, press Ctrl C, or if you're on a Mac like me, Command C, or you could right click and copy. Would also work. Oh, my page just refreshed. Frustrating. Do this, and then copy. This is not the right code. How funny. It's taken me back to my other code. So let's go back to the one I was just working on. That was the one I was working on earlier. My stream all. Accidentally hit the back button. Okay. And I'm going to copy and paste my global variables so that I can use them in my return all shows function as well. Control V or Command V. Okay. Inside this function, I'm going to create my database of all the shows that are in the various streaming services. And I'm going to do that by creating lists. So I'm going to call my lists Netflix library. It's kind of another name for a group of content. Usually we use it for books, like a library, but you can also have a music library or a video library. And to make it into a list, I'm going to use the square brackets. And inside my list, I'm going to comma separate, so use commas to separate different objects within the list. So the first one I'm going to create, you could actually refer to shows that you like on these platforms, but just to prove that it's working, I'm just going to use show 1, comma, show 2, comma, show 3. Okay, so I've just stored show 1, show 2, and show 3 in the Netflix library. And that is now made Netflix library a list that stores those 3 things. Now going to make the Disney Plus library. And I'm going to store show 4, show 5, show 6. And finally, I'm not sure why Netflix library has gone weird here, but there we go. Oh, I don't know why that is hyphenated, but hopefully we'll find out if that creates a bug later. Finally, I'm going to make my Amazon Prime library, and I'm just going to call these ones show 7, show 8, and show 9. Okay, so my Netflix library, I have show 1, 2, and 3. Disney Plus, show 4, 5, and 6, and Prime, show 7, 8, and 9. And obviously the function that I'm trying to create is to return to the user, or at the end of the function, return all of the shows depending on whether the user has streaming services. So if they have Netflix, I want to return shows 1, 2, and 3. And if they have Disney Plus, shows 4, 5, and 6. If they don't have Amazon Prime, then I don't want to return 7, 8, and 9. So in order to do that, I will create another list, and at this point, I'll just keep it empty, and we're going to call this one full library, or I could call it something like master library, but this is going to be a new list that's going to store all of the shows that are available across each of the platforms, and this is what we'll use to display to the user what they have to watch, so they don't have to go to each individual platform. And to make an empty list, just do equals and then open bracket, close bracket, and just leave it empty, and I'll go on to the next line. Okay, as you can see, I'm kind of keeping each part of my code separate. These are my global variables. This is my kind of database of shows and my full library list. All my lists are together. I'm now going to make some if conditions that are all together too. And so what I want to do is, if the user does have Netflix, I want to add show 1, 2, and 3 to the full library, and so on and so forth for the other streaming services as well. So I'm going to type the word if, and I'm going to check out what is stored in the user has Netflix variable. So I'm going to call that user has Netflix. If user has Netflix equals equals, I need to use a double equals because I'm comparing what's stored in here to whatever is on the other condition. So if user has Netflix equals true, what is true, then I want to add whatever is stored in Netflix library to my full library list. And to do that, I'm going to type the name of my library that I want to add to. I'm going to type full library. Now I'm going to use the dot append function to the end of it. So I've typed full library, that's the name of my list, and I'm going to append, which means to add to. So I'm going to put dot or period append, A-P-P-E-N-D. And then within some parentheses, curly parentheses, I want to tell my program what it is that I want to add to full library. This is what we're adding to. This is showing that we want to add it, and then this is what we're actually adding, and what we'll be adding is the Netflix library. So anything that's stored in the list Netflix library. So I'm going to copy and paste just so that I know that my spelling is the same across each. So if the user does have Netflix, add whatever is in the Netflix library to the full library. So it will add show 1, 2, and 3 to the full library here, which is currently empty. I don't need an else statement for this because if they don't have it, then I don't want to do anything. I don't want to add anything, take anything away, just leave it as it is. We're now going to check if user has the other streaming services. So if user has Disney Plus, or if user has Disney Plus equals true, remember use the capital T and then a colon, hit enter, and I want to add to my full library list. I'm going to type full library dot append, and then within the brackets I'm going to take the list name. That's what I'm adding. So if they do have Disney Plus, I'm going to add whatever's stored in the Disney Plus library, show 4, 5, and 6, to my full library list. And finally, I'm going to see if the user has Amazon Prime. Oops, that wouldn't have worked. True, colon. Then I'm going to add to my full library list, full library dot append, and I'm going to add the Amazon Prime library. Oops. That would have sucked. I'm going to do Control V. Okay, great. So this is all good, but what I need to do in order to access this data, this list outside of my variable, because at the moment it's a local variable, it's only within the function, I need to return whatever is stored in full library at the end of the function. So to do that, I'm going to make sure I'm in the line of my if conditions, and they're going to type the word return. And you see it's gone blue. And what I'm going to return to the user after calling that function is whatever is stored in full library. So what's handy here is I can see I've spelt this all the same, because when I highlight it, it shows me that these are all the same because they're all blue. And if I was to type it in manually to check my spelling, highlight this, and yeah, it's the same because they're all highlighted. So I'm returning whatever is stored in my full library. And that is my complete return all shows function. It doesn't actually print it to the console. We'll do that next. But when I call this function, return all shows, it will store the value based on whether the user has Netflix, Disney Plus, or Amazon, and store to our master list or our full library list all of the shows that are on those platforms. Okay, so let's test our code. So underneath printing the values, we know that works, so I'm going to get rid of that. We're going to call our next function. So it's going to choose your streaming services, and the next function is going to show or return all the shows. Now, as I said, it doesn't actually print it, it just returns the value. So in order to print this, I need to type print, open bracket, and then what's really cool, because return all shows has a value within it when it's called, I can actually just put the function within a print statement. So I can do print and then return all shows, open bracket, close bracket. So we'll print whatever is returned from return all shows. It's a little bit complicated, but hopefully that makes sense. So return all shows, just check the spelling, return all shows, capital letters, and it's in snake case with my underscores. It's going to print whatever's in there. So this is my currently 2-line code for my whole program of the actual code running, but obviously this refers to these functions at the top. What's cool though is that these functions could be stored elsewhere, but in this case I'm storing it all in the same file because that's just easier. Okay, so I'm going to click run, and hopefully it will choose my streaming services, and then it will print all of the shows that get added to my library depending on which streaming services I tell it that I have. So I'm going to click run. Hopefully we don't have any bugs. Oh, there you go. We have some bugs already. So what's going wrong here? It's saying invalid syntax, return all shows, and this is on line 36. Let's go to line 36. Return, I forgot my colon. Sorry guys. So whenever you define a function, you need to do def and the name of the function, open close brackets, and then the colon. I missed that. So it should work now. So what was happening there is it was coming to this line, printing return all shows. It's like, I don't know what that is because I hadn't properly defined it. I'm going to hit run now. Do you have Netflix? Sure. Do you have Disney? Sure. Do you have Amazon Prime? Let's say no. Aha! So let's see what's returned. Not very attractive, but because there's a bunch of punctuation, but it does say show 1, show 2, show 3, show 4, show 5, and show 6. And let's just test to see if that is correct. I told it I had Netflix and Disney Plus, and in Netflix we have show 1, show 2, and show 3. In Disney Plus I have show 4, show 5, and show 6. And what's interesting here is that you can see by the punctuation where the open brackets and close brackets are. It's showing me this list, the Netflix list, with an open bracket here and a closed bracket here, and then it's got a comma, and then it's showing me the Amazon Prime list. So these are kind of two separate lists that have been stored in a bigger list. So the full library list is actually a list of lists. So it's kind of like if you were to create a shopping list, but you were going to 2 different grocery stores or 3 different grocery stores, and on your shopping list it says Aldi and Jewel, and then the main thing is one list, the big list, but then you'll have a sub list of everything you need to get from Aldi, and then a sub list of everything you get from Jewel. So it's kind of like a list of lists, and that's what we have here too. And we know that because we have the main list, open and close brackets here and here, and within that we have one list here and another list here. So it's a list of lists, and that's going to change affect how we display this, because we want to display it a little bit nicely like this. I just want to display it in a full list from top to bottom, but it is working, so that's great. So instead of printing return all shows, I am going to temporarily store that list in another list, and I'm just going to use the same list name, full library, to store what is returned from my function. So I'm going to come before return all shows, I'm going to type full library. In a way, this full library variable or list is different to this one up here, because this is a local variable. I'm now creating another variable that is outside of my function, but because they're referring to the same thing, they don't interact with each other, and it just keeps it more simple. I could call it master library, I could call it dog. It doesn't really matter what I call it, as long as I use the same thing every time. So I'm going to store inside full library whatever is returned from my return all shows function. Then the trick of displaying that in a nice way, we're actually going to use a loop, and the loop we're going to use is a for loop. And the way that this works is it kind of looks at lists. It's really used in lists or databases, and it will say for everything in the list do something. So I'm going to type the word for, and you see it's turned blue. And what's cool about this next bit is that you can write anything you want. It doesn't matter. You could say for pigeons in loft, or for dogs in kennel. You can write whatever you want. But in my case, I want to return for every library in, and then this bit does matter. I need to refer to the list. But what this is basically doing is getting for everything that's in this list, do something. So for library in full library, because as I said, in full library there's 2 libraries, or if I said that I had all of the streaming services, there'd be 3 libraries stored, or 3 lists. I could use the term lists if that makes more sense. For lists in full library list, do the following. And I want it to print each library or each list that is stored in there. So I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to say print, and now I'm going to use this term up here. That's why I said it doesn't matter as long as they're the same. So for every library in full library, I want you to print the library. I know this is a bit difficult to get your head around, but basically, if our full library included all 3 libraries, then it would say for each of the 3 libraries in the bigger full library list, I want you to print the library. So let's see what happens when we do this. Let's hit run, and let's say that we have all the streaming services. Why? Okay, this is a little bit better. It's now, rather than just having one long line, it's now printed them kind of from top to bottom. We have show 1, show 2, show 3, show 4, show 5, show 6, show 7, show 8, show 9. But it still hasn't kind of just given them in one nice long list. In order to do this, we need to do something really clever, and that is actually using 2 for loops within each other. So this is the reason why this is currently printing 3 lines of my lists, kind of my databases of shows. So because I'm saying for every library, like my next Netflix library, my Disney Prime library, and my Amazon Prime library, in full library, which is my list of all the shows that I have, print each library. So it's printed the Netflix library, it's printed the Disney Plus library, and now it's printed the Amazon Prime library. But what I want to do is to just print each show within each of those libraries. So what's cool is I can make another for loop within that for loop. So I'm going to say for within every library in all of my libraries, and for every show in each library. So for every show, for show in library, so it's taking each library, colon, I want to print show. I could say film, as long as I could use any word. I could say dog, but we want to use something that makes more sense. So this is referring to each library, and this is referring to each show in each library. So for every library in the full list of libraries, do this. And so it will come to the Netflix library, and it will say for every show in this library, the Netflix library, print the show. So it'll print show 1, and then show 2, and then show 3. And then it will get to the end of the list, and it will come back to my for loop. And it will say for the next library, so for the Amazon Prime library, in the full list of libraries, print each show in the Amazon Prime library. And it will print show 4, show 5, show 6. So that's kind of how it works. Let's see if this works. So let's hit run, and let's test our code. So do you have Netflix? Yes. Do you have Disney Plus? Yes. Do you have Amazon Prime? Sure. Woohoo! And there you have it. We have our master list of shows. We've told the application what streaming services we have, and it's telling us which shows. Now let's test with some different scenarios. If I was to say I don't have Netflix, but I do have Disney Plus and I do have Amazon, then in theory we should get shows 4 through 9, but we shouldn't get shows 1 through 3. So let's hit enter. There you go, shows 4 through 9. Let's test another thing. Let's just say we just have Disney Plus, so we don't have Netflix, we do have Disney Plus, we don't have Amazon Prime. We should get shows 4 through 6. And there you go, shows 4 through 6. That's all we're going to do today. There's some really good functionality within this program already. In order to improve this program, if you want, what we might add is to not just say the name of the show, but where it's stored. Maybe you could even include a link as well to where it's stored, so that the user can click on the link and it takes them to that page. And what's cool is you can actually go to the streaming service on your computer and copy and paste the link from the URL bar and then just store it within that database. You just got to make sure you store it within this show kind of element. And I could put show 1, this one is on Netflix, and it's stored at this web address. So https blah 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 netflix.com. And now when it shows me the shows from Netflix, it shows me not only what the show is called, but it shows me where it is, and then it gives me a link to click on it. So that'd be some cool functionality to add. Okay, so hopefully that inspires you a little bit. Hopefully also we can meet again next week, and we'll be going on to websites. Okay, bye guys.